bit about my story first before we get on with this. Wow, we're already 25 minutes into this. I started writing about 17 years ago. My kids were all homeschooled, and that was the impetus for me, was helping them with their writing. She said, my wife and I have 7 children. She and I have been married 31 years, and she is the most wonderful woman in the world. I think I said that this morning, too. Sorry, guys. She's taken. And so we were trying to teach them how to write. So I started writing a story for my kids to get them involved in the creative process and get them to love writing. And we shared our ideas and wrote this story together. And they got really excited about writing. And it worked. All my kids now enjoy writing, as you can tell from Amanda. My oldest son, James, has written a novel. He's also written this expansive story that's over 10,000 pages long that he wants to split into 12 novels. I don't know if he'll ever do that, but he loves to write. But this process of getting my kids to write decided a passion in me to write. I was a computer geek. I was a computer professional. I like math and science, and I like sports too. Writing to me was just a tool to get things done. It wasn't something that sparked any creativity in me. But when I got through with this story for my kids, I realized how powerful storytelling could be. The story we wrote together actually changed them. Because when we shared ideas together, they came up with things that were important to them, things they were going through, struggles or issues. So when I was able to incorporate these themes into my stories, it affected them. So I decided when we got the story finished, I'm going to get it published. So I sent it out to publishers, and they said, no, we're not going to publish your story. So I got all these rejection notices, and so I was thinking maybe I just need to get better at writing. So I went to those writers' conferences, I got books on writing, and I learned that I had a lot to learn. So over the next few years, I set out to become a better writer. Well, about 2 years into this process, I had a dream one night about a boy who could breathe fire. And it was a vivid dream, so I decided to tell my kids about it. I told my oldest son about it, and said, Dad, that's a cool dream. We should write this story instead of the other stuff, because this is a fantasy story. You know, I love fantasy stories so much. This is a guy who's read Lord of the Rings 30 times. He loves fantasy. So I wanted to investigate what is the allure of fantasy, especially in young readers. So I studied it, I analyzed it. You know, computer geek in me, I analyze things to death. So I studied fantasy, what people wrote about fantasy. So I came up with some ideas about why fantasy works. So I called this presentation Fantasy Stories of Heroism. Because I think that all of us are wired to be heroes in some sense. It doesn't mean we're going to go out with swords and battle dragons or rescue the fair maiden or lead armies, but every one of us goes through conflicts. Every one of us has problems to solve. And we may have act sacrificially along the way and become heroes in our own worlds. And fantasy stories help us to see that and understand it. And I think it especially affects young readers. So we're going to look at that. How does fantasy affect readers? What are the characteristics of positive fantasy and what you can do to help promote good fantasy? And I write it this way because there are fantasy stories out there that are not positive, that actually have negative themes in them, trying to teach us things that I think aren't good. And we're going to talk about some of those, and when I give examples, I might step on some toes of some favorite fantasy stories out there. We'll see about that. Okay. How does fantasy affect readers? The first one is it inspires character building. When we have fantasy heroes who go out and do dangerous things, and they do it, they sacrificial actions, willing to give of themselves, maybe even willing to be wounded or even die for the cause, it helps us see that virtuous hero. And fantasy allows for this a lot better than the other genres do, Because with other genres, people say, well, nobody's that good. It's just too unbelievable. But somehow, fantasy allows this virtuous, larger-than-life hero. We can point to some of them, Peter in Chronicles of Narnia, or Frodo, or Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, and all these wonderful things that they do, and these sacrificial acts, and it seems to be more believable in fantasy. It's one of the reasons I decided to write fantasy, because I believe in the virtuous hero. I believe they really exist, or can, if they would get the role models to go along with the teaching that we believe. We believe the Bible, and there's lots of heroes there. If we could see more and more role models for those virtuous heroes, I think it would stick better. It enhances a desire to read. I know lots of reluctant readers who, once they pick up a fantasy book, they say, well, this is all right. I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from moms that said, my son wouldn't read anything, not even the back of a cereal box, but he picked up your book and wouldn't put it down until he was done. He skipped dinner, he skipped breakfast. I never see him do that. And now he'll read anything. You see, a reluctant reader might pick it up and read it, and then find out, well, it wasn't so hard. And start to like to read, because it reminds me of exercise to go ahead and take input in through the written word, and they become better readers. It builds the imagination. I guess that's a no-brainer with fantasy. It opens up the mind and allows them to exercise it, to think about things they might not otherwise think about. And one reason that's very important in the Christian world is that we believe in things that we can't see. We believe in angels, we believe in demons. The Bible says we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers, things that we can't see. And when fantasy opens up the mind to think about things that you can't see, things that we don't see in our culture, it also, I think, exercises the mind to think on spiritual terms and realms, and think, well, maybe this could be true. Maybe, even though I don't see these things, maybe they are out there. Another thing that it does is it encourages friendships. Now, this is one that surprised me, because it wasn't something I came up with, but as I analyzed, this one I learned as my books became popular. One thing about fantasy is that usually the stories are very complex. They have riddles and prophecies and mysterious symbols, and readers get together and they say, what do you think this means? What do you think is going to happen next? Oh, I think that prophecy means this, and this symbol means that. So because of the complexity, they talk about it and say, well, what do you think is going to happen in the next book? And the next one after that. And when one reader finds another reader who likes the same book, and they immediately have a connection. And they're able to talk, and they say, well, if you like this book, and I like this book, maybe we have other things in common. So it really does bring about friendships. I created a message forum for my books, and we had hundreds of members, and over 1 million messages posted, and readers became really good friends, and we became best friends because they shared love of my books. So it's really been amazing to see how this friendship thing has worked out. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this, but all these drawings you see were sent to me by readers of my books. Some of them are really amazing. Okay, now fantasy stories also motivate through action, through all these ways: example, empowerment, empathy, and encouragement. I worked real hard to have ease on all those, okay? And I'm going to talk about each one. But the example is they see a hero. And it's especially effective for young people if the hero is also young. I always try to have my heroes be something either close to or above the age of my expected readers. So the heroes are usually 14 to 16 years old. It's someone that even younger readers, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, can look up to. So they see the example of someone doing something sacrificial, courageous, and willing to be selfless. Instead of thinking about myself, I want to rescue only me. Now I'm going to go in there and do this dangerous thing for somebody else at the risk of my own life. So they see this through an example. Also, the empowerment is important because Yes, it's dangerous. And look, one of the best things about fantasy stories, it looks like it's impossible for the hero to overcome the obstacle. There's no way that Frodo Baggins can beat Sauron. He's just too powerful. But in a good fantasy story, the hero finds empowerment from other sources and learns how to go about them, whether it's higher power like God, or friendships with other people, other warriors, and wherever they need to come from. So realizing our own inability and looking outward, outside of ourselves, to get that power, a good fantasy story will show that. And the Christian worldview fantasy would also show that the power often comes from on high. Through empathy, a lot of the characters are going to go through the most dangerous struggles you can imagine. This ain't your romance novel, that's for sure. We're talking about going through the valley of the shadow of death and into the dragon's claw, if you will. So many tremendous dangers. So when our characters suffer, in fantasy stories, the main characters and lots of characters suffer a lot, then the reader gets to empathize and think, what would I do in this situation? Would I be sacrificial? Would I still be a friend of this person? And so they start to think about that, and empathy becomes important in this attachment. And because fantasy shows all these dangerous environments, it brings about the empathetic thinking quite a bit. Also through encouragement. One thing that fantasy does is it usually has great, powerful friendships. Probably greater friendships than we might ever have. How about Frodo and Sam? You know, what kind of friendship do they have? And in my books, you have Billy and Walter, and Billy and Bunny, if you know about my stories. So, and they encourage each other. And that's one thing I really want to build in a fantasy story, is this, showing this example of encouragement. One thing that I see among young people is that it's cool to cut each other down. It's cool to have the best insult. I want to teach encouragement in building people up. And we see that more in fantasy. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in a minute. So we're going to talk about motivates through example. This is a clip from Lord of the Rings. This is Elrond, the Elf King. Now some people say I look like him. Is it true? If I can grow it out. Yeah, well, I can grow it out. So I look like a 5,000-year-old elf. So anyway, how many have not seen the Lord of the Rings movies? Okay, we're going to give you a little catch-up here on what's going on. Frodo is a little hobbit. He's about this high. He has obtained what's called a ring of power. And the bad guy Sauron wants this ring. He gets it, he can control all of Middle-earth. So he wants it. And Frodo has brought it to this elf king, Elrond, to try to find out what to do with it. They need to destroy it. But we're going to hear Elrond tell us that it can't be destroyed unless you take it to Mount Doom. And he has gathered this council of elves and dwarves and warrior humans to try to decide what to do with the ring. We're going to hear the arguing, but we're going to hear Boromir, one of the humans, tell how impossible it is to do this. And this entire time when he's describing how impossible it is, our little Frodo is listening to this, every word. Let's see what his reaction will be.